This video presentation that we have put together seeks to inform a public that is, in general, being lied to and preyed upon by the wicked Zionist elites. Who are these Zionist wicked elites? They are the wicked elite bloodline families and their agents who possess unlimited wealth and resources. Their agenda is quite simple: to depopulate the world, i.e., to bring the number of persons living in the world down to what they deem to be acceptable numbers, as enunciated on the Georgia Guidestones. We are specifically speaking to our black communities who I know are not aware of or even heard this information. Most black folk are seeking to make a living. We work 8 to 12 hours on our job, providing for our families, paying bills, raising children, and in general, we are trying to make the best life we can for ourselves. So we do not have time to understand the sciences, i.e. biology, microbiology, chemistry, and DNA science. Even more, we do not take the time to think critically on these matters. And because of all this is true, the powers that be, the Luciferians, the agents of Satan, are in the best position to work out their agendas for our destruction and death. It is not our purpose here to discuss the mysteries of the Georgia Guidestones and how they were destroyed. Our purpose in this presentation is to give proof of the fact that what the elites are using to further their agenda of death and destruction is the lies behind germ theory. Germ theory is nothing but a soft kill. The germ theory is defined as the theory that certain diseases are caused by the invasion of the body by microorganisms, organisms too small to see except through a microscope. The French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, the English surgeon Joseph Lister, and the German physician Robert Koch are given much of the credit for development and acceptance of the theory. In the mid-19th century, Pasteur showed that fermentation and putrefaction are caused by organisms in the air. The microorganisms spoken of that cause this invasion of the body are known as bacteria, fungi, but especially viruses. What are viruses? Do they really exist? And if they exist, do they cause disease? These are the questions that sincere scientists and doctors during the Spanish flu epidemic sought out to answer. The COVID-19 pandemic was not the first pandemic this country suffered. When researchers look back in the annals of time, they find that there was one notable and very identical pandemic that occurred in 1918. When one compares the pandemic to the one suffered from late 2019 to 2022, the similarities are uncanny. Notice these newspaper clippings back during that 1918 era. Especially this newspaper clipping that has the headline, "Masks Show Individuality of Wearers." and these newspaper clippings. And does this message below sound familiar? Wear a mask and save your life? Really? And take a look at these articles and newspaper clippings from that era. Schools closed, libraries closed, funerals banned, quarantine orders. Sound familiar? Now, the attempt to answer the question, does germs cause diseases? Here's what's really surprising. The attempt to prove germ theory was done in that same year, in 1918, during the Spanish flu epidemic. Through crude and direct means of contact of body fluids and body secretions from infected persons to healthy persons. And it is significantly noteworthy that these studies were not presented to the public because none of these experiments yielded positive results and actually disproved the germ theory. But this is the theory of medicine that the huge pharmaceutical companies have greatly profited from. When it comes to truth, most of the time you have to follow the money.
The end of germ theory. The nearly 460-year-old idea that germs, and more recently theoretical viruses, cause illness, disease, and death is known as the germ theory of disease. The reason it cannot be called germ fact to this day is because there are two very simple ways to prove it. Both have been done, and not only could they not prove it, but both disproved it. This is not to say that there are not other bioelectric mechanisms, bioresonant communication, and shared mental, pharmaceutical, and environmental factors that do make it seem that certain people do get the same detox symptoms we call disease or cellular dis-ease after being around each other, which we will cover at the end of this film. But as you will see, it is neither germs nor theoretical virus particles that are the cause of such phenomenon. The first, very simple way to prove germ contagion theory is to expose hundreds of healthy people in every way possible to the breath and body fluids of sick people and see if those healthy people get sick from the exposure, which was done during the 1918 alleged Spanish flu pandemic by Dr. Milton J. Rosenau, along with the U.S. Navy and U.S. Public Health Service. The volunteers were all of the most susceptible age, mostly between 18 and 25 years old, only a few of them around 30 years old, and all were in good physical condition. None of these volunteers, 100 in all, had influenza. They proceeded rather cautiously at first by administering what they claimed was a pure culture of bacillus of influenza, meaning bacteria found in the boogers and lung fluid of people with Spanish flu symptoms, called Pfeiffer's bacillus, in a rather moderate or small amount, sprayed into the nostrils of a few of the healthy volunteers. But all of those trials proved negative, meaning none of those volunteers who got bacteria from people sick with the Spanish flu sprayed up into their nostrils got sick with the flu themselves. So they became bolder and selected 19 of their 100 volunteers and gave each one of them a very large quantity of a mixture of 13 different strains of the Pfeiffer bacillus that they had recently obtained from the lungs at necropsy, meaning lung fluid from a dead corpse who died of pneumonia. These 13 corpse-retrieved organisms were sprayed in an atomizer into the nose and the eyes of the healthy volunteers and back into their throats, while the healthy volunteers were breathing in. They used some billions of these bacterial organisms according to their own estimated counts, but none of the healthy volunteers got sick. Next, they collected the snot and mucus secretions from the mouth, nose, throat, and lung bronchi from the sick people and transferred this mixture into their healthy volunteers. The snot was blown from the sick nostrils into a tray. Bronchial mucus was obtained by coughing up the lung phlegm. Then swabs were taken from the mucous surface of the nostrils and also the mucous membrane of the throat. They mixed all that up together and sprayed it into each nostril and into the throat of the healthy volunteer while they inhaled, and sprayed it on their eyes. None of these people got sick. Some of that same mixture was then filtered and injected into other volunteers, but produced no results. None of them got sick. Next, they took new snot and phlegm samples from new sick people. This time, they sprayed a much larger amount into their nostrils, throat, and eyes, and then they made the healthy volunteers swallow the rest of the sick mucus, but none of them got sick. Next, they tried immediate direct transfer from sick person to healthy person, taking little cotton swabs on the end of sticks, and transferred the sick mucus directly from nose to nose and throat to throat to the 19 healthy volunteers. And they used a special throat tube for the throat culture to make sure they got not only the material from the tonsils, but also from the posterior nasopharynx, way in the back of the throat. None of the healthy volunteers who received the material directly transferred from sick cases got sick themselves in any way. And this procedure was done to all 19 volunteers at least twice, and some of them 3 times, but none of them got sick. So next they tried an experiment using injections of blood. Blood from the sick people were injected into each of 10 new healthy volunteers, but none of them got sick in any way. So they collected a lot of mucus material from the upper respiratory tract of sick people, ran that through a filter, and injected that phlegm into 10 new volunteers with a needle, and none of them got sick in any way. Puzzled and frustrated, next they led a healthy volunteer to the bedside of a sick patient. He sat down alongside the bed of the patient. They shook hands, got as close as he conveniently could, and they talked for 5 minutes. At the end of the 5 minutes, the sick person breathed out as hard as he could, while the volunteer's face was muzzle to muzzle, 2 inches apart from the sick breath, and was instructed to breathe in as the other breathed out in his mouth. They repeated this 5 times in a row, and after that, the sick patient coughed directly into the face of the healthy volunteer 5 different times. Then after all of that, they moved the healthy volunteer to the next sick patient selected and repeated that entire procedure until each of the 10 healthy volunteers had done this with 10 sick people in a row. Then they were all watched carefully for 7 days, and you guessed it, none of them got sick. Not one. They tried another set of experiments with 50 people that also failed, that he said was too long to go into, and they tried another one with 6 people that failed, and then they gave up. Not only did they not prove the Spanish flu was contagious, but they clearly disproved it. And Dr. Rosenau wasn't even the first to fail, because at the end of his paper, he cites that he already knew that Dr. McCoy and Dr. Ritchie did a similar set of experiments on Goat Island Quarantine Station off San Francisco, and used volunteers who had not been exposed to the Spanish flu outbreak at all, and they too had negative results. They were unable to reproduce the disease. Sure enough, we see it in the public health reports published January 10, 1919, called Some Interesting Though Unsuccessful Attempts to Transmit Spanish Influenza Experimentally. The San Francisco Angel or Goat Island Quarantine Station experiments, carried out by Dr. G.W. McCoy of the United States Public Health Service and Lieutenant Dwayne Ritchie of the United States Navy. A group of 10 men were divided into 2 squads of 5. One group had put up their nostrils a heavy suspension of liquid cultures made of 8 strains of Pfeiffer's bacillus bacteria without filtration. The other group had the same mixture but put through a Berkefield candle purifier. The results were negative. Nobody got sick after being observed for 7 days. Next, 40 volunteers were put in 4 groups of 10 each, and liquid secretions of phlegm and mucus from the upper respiratory passages of people sick with influenza within the last 1 or 2 days of onset were put up their noses with both medicine droppers and sprayed up their nose with atomizers. In every case, the results were negative. So far as the reproduction of influenza is concerned, nobody got sick. Next, they made a filtered liquid from the phlegm and mucus taken from the upper air passages of a person sick with acute influenza, and used a dropper to put it in the mucous membrane of the eyes of 2 volunteers. And then the same phlegm and mucus was injected into the skin of a 3rd volunteer. In each case, the results were negative. None of them got sick. So finally, just like Dr. Rosenau, they took blood from a person sick with influenza and injected it into one healthy volunteer with negative results. He did not get sick. How could the Spanish flu have been some highly contagious disease if teams of medical doctors and volunteers bending over backwards and doing cartwheels couldn't even make just one person sick after hundreds of volunteers and attempts? Short answer, it couldn't. Around this same time, in October 1919, in the Journal of Medicine, we read a letter to the editor from a New York doctor, Alfred F. Hess, titled, "Need of Further Research on the Transmissibility of Measles and Varicella, which is chickenpox." Dr. Hess wrote to the editor, "I have just read the abstract in the journal of Dr. Sellard's article on the insusceptibility of man to inoculation with blood from measles patients, carried out at Johns Hopkins, September 1919. It is remarkable that Dr. Sellards was unable to produce this highly infectious disease by means of the blood or the nasal secretion of infected individuals into healthy volunteers. Not long ago, however, I had a similar experience with varicella, meaning chickenpox. Thus, we are confronted with 2 diseases, the 2 most infectious diseases of the endemic diseases in this part of the world, which we are unable to transmit artificially from man to man. It is remarkable that in the middle of the Spanish flu pandemic, he doesn't mention the Spanish flu as one of the 2 most infectious endemic diseases in that part of the world at that time. But more remarkable that here again, we have 2 more doctors who failed to produce contagious transmission with 2 other alleged contagious germ diseases. As we fast forward from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic to the polio contagion experiments carried out in 1949 and the early 1950s, we run into the exact same problem. On page 105 of her 1957 book, The Poison Needle, Dr. Eleanor McBean tells us, during one of our most widespread polio epidemics in 1949, contraction of polio, or catching polio, by definite contact with other victims of the polio disease was not established in an elaborate study made by the New York State Health Department. The United States Public Health Service in its studies also found the same negative answer during succeeding outbreaks of polio later. In short, they learned that the disease was not contagious. Time magazine commented on this unexpected revelation of these surveys by remarking that when and where people catch polio remains a mystery. The supposition, meaning an assumption based on zero fact or evidence, that viruses entered through the mouth and nose led to the experimenters to make exhaustive tests on both animals and human beings, mostly prisoners and orphans in institutions. They were exposed by close association or close contact to polio patients, and their throats and nasal passages were frequently swabbed with matter from the sick patients that was supposed to contain viruses. No polio was produced in this way, and about the only noticeable effect was that the subjects of the experiments lost their sense of taste and smell due to the damaging effect of the poisons in the serum that was used on the test swabs. And we're going to examine one of these failed polio studies together later in this film so you can see for yourself. Johns Hopkins magazine tells us into the 1950s, and in some cases longer, physicians had experimented on prisoners, orphans, soldiers, and even newborn infants without the full consent of the subjects, or by deceiving the subjects about the purpose of intervention. But deceiving the public about viruses and vaccines is where they morally draw the line.
So now, what is polio and what caused the Spanish flu? How did the masses of people really get sick? How do we account for their sickness? So now, here's the question. If germs, i.e. bacteria, fungi, and viruses did not cause the Spanish flu epidemic or polio or the measles, then what did? Well, pay close attention as you watch this next video.
If some government food agency or sandwich shop kept assuring you that this was chicken noodle soup, but kept serving you this sandwich instead, at what point would you start to question the legitimacy of that claim? In order to understand the logical fallacies in the thinking of big pharma-sponsored virologists and see the obvious flaws in the Petri dish experiments they use as proof that their unproven germ theory is possibly correct, we need to go back in time again and ask, what is polio and what caused the Spanish flu, if not germs? Dr. Eleanor McBean was actually there, as were her two doctor parents and colleagues who were healing the victims. According to them, ironically, the Spanish flu pandemic was caused by multiple toxic vaccines, kept alive with the addition of more poisonous drugs administered by the doctors who tried to suppress the symptoms caused by the vaccines themselves. We know that the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research carried out a large-scale bacterial meningitis vaccination campaign in the U.S. Army in 1917 and 1918, supervised by Frederick Lamont Gates, under supervision of his father, Frederick Taylor Gates. We can see one of the published studies carried out on soldiers in Fort Riley, Kansas in late 1917, the start of the Spanish flu pandemic, where soldiers were being given 3 increasing dosage amounts of bacterial meningitis vaccines in 4 to 10-day intervals. Even if you are ignorantly pro-vax, would you go out and take 3 increasing doses of polio, flu shots, or COVID-19 vaccinations in 2 weeks? They called it the Spanish flu, yet Spain remained neutral in World War I, and German submarines patrolled their coast, so the U.S. didn't even have soldiers and bases in Spain. It also took 6 to 8 days just to sail troops home from France to the U.S., never mind the extra time to get home to the other states and bases. Yet, the first reported Spanish flu cases all broke out in the exact same time, not in Europe, but all around the United States, shown here in green and yellow, even in Southern California and, of course, Fort Riley, Kansas. When you lay the map of important U.S. military bases where mass vaccinations were taking place over the outbreak map, they match exactly. Dr. McBean's research into military vaccination records uncovered that they were not only giving these soldiers bacterial meningitis vaccines. That was only one of the 14 to 25 different shots given to the soldiers. As we ourselves have just seen, after a COVID-19 vaccine safety data document that they had hoped to remain sealed for 75 years was published, showing on page 30 a 9-page list of over 1,300 diseases already caused by just one COVID-19 vaccine worldwide, and that's just from one manufacturer. So what kind of diseases were these soldiers getting from a combination of 14 to 25 different vaccines at once? Many of the soldiers were insane from post-vaccinal encephalitis, but the doctors called it shell shock, even though many of the soldiers had never left American soil. The conglomerate disease brought on by the 14 to 25 poisonous vaccines baffled the doctors, as they had never had a vaccination spree before, which used so many different vaccines. The vaccines brought on high fever, extreme weakness, abdominal rash, and intestinal disturbances characteristic of typhoid. The diphtheria vaccine caused lung congestion, chills and fever, swollen sore throat, clogged with the false membrane, and the choking suffocation because of difficulty in breathing, followed by gasping and death, after which the body turned black from stagnant blood that had been deprived of oxygen in the suffocation stages. In the early days, they called it Black Death. Does this look like any flu symptoms you've ever experienced or seen in your life? The other vaccines caused their own reactions: paralysis or polio, brain damage, lockjaw, and more. When doctors had tried to suppress the symptoms of vaccine-induced typhoid with a stronger vaccine, it caused a worse form of typhoid, which they named paratyphoid. But when they concocted an even stronger and more dangerous vaccine to suppress that one, they created an even worse disease, which they didn't even have a name for. They didn't want to tell people what it really was: their own Frankenstein monster, which they themselves had created with their vaccines and suppressive medicines. They wanted to shift the blame away from their vaccines, so they called it the Spanish influenza, which explains the soldiers. But what about the regular civilian people? Did this maskless body collector know the truth? That the First World War was of a short duration, so the vaccine makers were unable to use up all of their vaccines on the soldiers, so they decided to sell it to the rest of the population. They drummed up the largest vaccination campaign in U.S. history. Their propaganda claimed the soldiers were coming home from countries with all kinds of contagious diseases, and that everyone must have all of the shots on the market. The people believed them. First of all, they wanted to believe their doctors, just like today. And second, The returning soldiers certainly had been sick from their vaccines. So no, a virus or bacteria did not cause the Spanish flu, and vaccines did not eradicate it. Vaccines caused it. And once they were sold out of vaccines, the pandemic instantly stopped. But what is more interesting about Dr. McBean and her doctor parents living through the Spanish flu pandemic is that their testimony too debunks the contagion myth. She tells us that the flu hit only the vaccinated. Those who had refused the shots escaped the flu. Her family had refused all the vaccinations, so they all remained well all the time. Hers seemed to be the only family which didn't get the flu, so her doctor parents went from house to house doing what they could to look after the sick, as it was impossible to get a doctor then. Just like the failed contagion experiments we've already discussed, if it were possible for germs, bacteria, virus, or bacilli to cause disease, they had plenty of opportunity to attack her parents when they were spending many hours every day in the sick rooms. But they didn't get the flu, and they didn't bring any germs home to attack the children and cause anything. None of her family had the flu, not even a sniffle, and it was in the winter with deep snow on the ground. Only the vaccinated died. Then we have the strange case of the two Russian conjoined twins, Masha and Dasha, who each had their own lungs and organs, but because their circulatory systems were interconnected, they shared the same blood. Dasha was always prone to colds, but not Masha. And as children, one would become ill with a childhood disease like measles, while the other would not. If the measles was a bug, it would have been in both of their bodies and in their collective bloodstream. So why didn't they both get the measles? This phenomenon was seen over and over again with the girls. Flus, colds, and other childhood diseases were all experienced separately, never together, which would explain why neither Dr. Sellards of Johns Hopkins nor Dr. Hess of New York were able to transmit measles or chickenpox in all of their experiments, because germ theory is nonsense pseudoscience.
If you've paid close attention to the video, you probably noticed the name in this particular report. Here we have that name circled. The name is Frederick L. Gates, MD. And here we had a picture and a caption from an article in the Australian Morning Herald, and we have the link at the bottom if you care to follow the link. The caption is Bill Gates' grandfather, Dr. Frederick L. Gates, was involved with Rockefeller experiment bacterial meningitis jab that killed 100 million in 1918 to 1920. Now think about that for a minute. We hope to continue this idea of the debunking of germ theory of disease in another slide presentation. Stay tuned.